All right. I want to start by saying what a breath of fresh air you are. I knew that up front, but I just read your book, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And now I feel like not only do I know you a little bit better, but just so amazing to have someone like you in the world. So thank you for all you're doing. I'm pre-thanking you before we even get started.
Well, thank you.
Of course. My first question to you is, and I've thought a lot about this question, and I think you touch on it when you talk about Trump in the book and the fact that some of the people you talked to when you were first running for Senate said that they liked him because he was an outsider. You're an outsider, and I think that's a good thing in this day and age, right? So you got your BA in industrial and graphic design at Notre Dame, a typical degree that all politicians get these days. I'm just kidding. And you have a refreshing lack of law degree. I think this is the reason, or one of the many reasons, but a reason why your messages are breaking through. Does that make sense? Do you agree with that?
I think so. When you go to school for industrial design, so we are trained to solve problems, no matter what it is you're designing. It's a hair dryer, but people's complaints are that hair dryers are too heavy. So how do you make one that's lighter? I was a car designer. I designed toys. There's always a goal in mind. And to get there, you sketch 1,000 different options and then you test them and you build models and you hold them and you feel them and you have focus groups and you get feedback and you iterate and you keep going and there are rounds and rounds and rounds of revision until you get to a final product that you put out into the world. And if that product doesn't work out, you scrap it and you make another one, which I think is a very different mindset than lawyers. And this is no offense to lawyers. We need lawyers, but lawyers, you're defending your case no matter what it is. So you have your stance. And we've seen this in my job. People have their one idea for a bill and they think that's it. That's the only idea that could possibly work. And they are so dead set on defending and fighting for their idea that they seem unwilling to take in feedback and change and modify. And I think my design background has served me well. I also learned in school how to separate critiques of my work from critiques of myself. Art critiques, I know this may sound, like light work. It is hard. I have had some of my concepts that I have spent weeks, if not months on, like torn off the wall, stomped on the ground, ripped to shreds, and had to recognize that's not a critique of me, it's the work. The work is separate of yourself. So we also are storytellers in design. When you design a product, you have to talk about it. You tell a story. My process as a designer was I was always creating in my mind who is the person, the one person that I'm making this product for, not, an entire group of people. But when you're imagining a person, who are they? What is their age? What do they like to do? What are their hobbies? What are their family? What do they eat? And you design very hyper specifically to one person and then realize that actually appeals to a broad swath of people, but you have some specificity because it's a real person, not just this idea of what women should be or what men should be or what Republicans should be or what Democrats should be. That's been really helpful.
Well, I appreciate that answer. And I think this next question I'm going to ask speaks a little bit to another component of you, and this is your upbringing. You thread through the book a number of times just sort of how influential your mom in particular was. And one of the things I loved, and I think I read this on the Wikipedia and it may have come up in one of the interviews, but definitely in the book as well, that after your parents were divorced, you were both regular, you're Catholic, you're regular churchgoers, and your local priest told your mother that she was not living up to the church's expectations,
Mhm.
despite attending church somewhat regularly and even going as far as teaching CCD, which is like the equivalent of Sunday school, I believe. Let's talk a little bit with the listeners about how your mom responded to this, because it was kind of like the perfect fu to the parish and the fact that she was not being a good Christian.
Yeah, I mean, my mom grew up in a very different parish than the one I grew up in, as like a lot of people. She moved to where she could afford to buy a house, and the parish where she grew up in was really service oriented. They started a soup kitchen. There were all of these volunteer opportunities to give back to the community, and I think she was always looking for that in our church, and our church was not set up that way. It was very establishment. It was this idea that if you are not sitting in the same pew every Sunday, you are not a good Catholic. And it was performative in a way. So, my mom taught CCD and I sang in the choir. And that meant that we were there not only every Sunday, but 3 or 4 nights a week. And like a lot of parents, my parents got divorced and recognized that it would be better for us if they went separate ways. And my dad and I are very close, and my mom and I are very close. And it was the right decision. My priest, I didn't write this in the book, but actually also fined my mom, like charged her like a $37 fine. I don't know why. And my mom was like, because I didn't know
That's
any
crazy.
better. I paid it because this is somebody in a position of authority and you do what you're told. So, I mean, it got to the point where I think my mom, having been separated and I think growing a little bit more independent, recognized this was not working for us. This was not what she was looking for. And ultimately, we left our church, which is a hard thing to do, but ventured out on our own. And I think she really found her footing in building community on her own and recognizing she didn't need an institution to help her do that, that her faith and her call to serve her community was much more powerful than, these walls in this building.
Well, and just taking it a step further, she volunteered and brought you along to volunteer in a soup kitchen nearby, right? So it was just the ultimate act of service. And I think this is a theme that I would highly encourage people to read the book. And again, we'll get more into it in a second. But it's this concept of actually not being performative, but really digging in and doing the things that you say you're going to do, which you're a model at this. I do want to ask you something, and this was really funny because I was preparing for this interview and I happened to get a robotext that came from one Senator, Mallory McMorrow.
That's me.
And I liked it and I actually used it in this because it talked about the fact that your approach for running for US Senate is the same as the one you took for running for the Michigan State Senate, i.e., no bullshit. Let's talk about what no bullshit means in your run.
Yeah, I mean, I've always called it like it is, and we live in a moment right now where I think we have to acknowledge that, particularly in a state like Michigan, people voted for Donald Trump. We can't pretend like this did not happen and bury our heads in the sand. And to me, that means there were enough people who are so rightfully angry and frustrated with the status quo that they were willing to blow it up because that's what he stands for. I had no shortage of people say that to me in my first run, and I was a surrogate for Vice President Harris on the Harris campaign, and I heard that in November that people knew that he was a felon, people knew that he said all of these things, and they knew about Project 2025, and they didn't care because they weren't doing as well as they had hoped, and they weren't as successful as they wanted, and that meant that the institution had failed, and he was willing to blow it up. There's also just, so I think I heard this metaphor once from a constituent, and I think about it all the time, that it feels like Democrats and Republicans are sitting down at a table playing chess, and the Republicans have flipped the table over and set the house on fire, and Democrats are still planning our next move. So there's, this fear to like break out of the institution, and you hear about norms and rules. And that's not to say that you lie and you do the same things, but you have to call bullshit bullshit. So when I was accused in 2022 of being a groomer by a colleague, I cut through and I took my own identity back. And I wish that more people, and it's not just about party, but who wanted to shape the future of our country, were willing to call out when things were just ugly attempts to weaponize people's rightful anger and fear about the fact that they're not doing as well as they had hoped to convince them it's somebody else's fault. It also means sometimes calling out my own party. We are not successful if we just retreat to our team and pretend that everything is fine so long as we're within our team, because it's not a game. It's not a sport. This is about the future of our communities and our families and our state and our country. And it's much more important than that. Finally, I tell my staff this all the time, and I try to do it across all of my communications, is no matter how complicated an issue is, you'd better damn well be able to talk about it like you would talk to your friend at a bar. And if you can't, you don't know it well enough. You got to simplify it. You need to be energetic and excited if it's something worth being excited about. If you're pissed off, be pissed off because people are pissed off. And I think we are in a time where people are so hungry and desperate for authenticity and they want to get to know the people who represent them that you got to shed, all of the expectations of what this is supposed to be and, no bullshit.
Well, two things. One, I appreciate the analogy of the chess and the fact that the Democrats are looking for the next move after the board's already been flipped over. And two, just I think speaking that truth to power on both sides, you've been somewhat famously known as saying that you wouldn't vote for Chuck Schumer as the, will be optimistic, the Senate majority lead when you're elected senator of the U.S. Senate. So I appreciate the candid, and I think we are at that. Pete Buttigieg is doing a great job. He's not running for anything, but he's not afraid to do that similar job. So thank you all for being so candid and honest. One of the things in doing my research that I absolutely loved and it tickled me to death was come to find out you had been on the Daily Show, I think numerous times. And I sat down, I was doing sort of late in the afternoon research with seeing you and Desi Levitt of the Daily Show. What was it like being interviewed? Like, she's one of my favorites. She's so funny. I mean, was it a little bit otherworldly when you were on the show?
It really was. Just for a point of correction, this is the only time I've been on The Daily Show. So
Okay.
as an elder millennial, if you will, I grew up on The Daily Show. And especially as somebody who was not always political, I think The Daily Show for me was a lot of kind of like my intro into this. Like, I did not go to college for political science. I didn't think about this all the time. I voted pretty consistently, but I think I had the relationship that most people had with politics, which is like I knew a little bit, but I wasn't really in it. So to be on the Daily Show was really surreal. I mean, Desi is lovely. I cannot say enough amazing things about her. She took time to meet me backstage before the show. She had clearly read my book. She had done her homework. Unlike you show up in some places and they're like, oh, I was given two talking points about you and I really don't know anything. Let's have a conversation. She was just earnest and wonderful. And I loved our interview. I mean, we talked for
It was a good interview. It was a really good
16
interview. Yeah.
minutes. Thank you. But she, you could tell sitting across that table, and it's funny because you think these shows are these massive things and the studio is much smaller than you expect. So it's weirdly intimate in a way, but you could tell she genuinely wanted the answer. Like, she would ask a question, and just the way that she engaged, it wasn't just waiting for her next line or to get a joke in. It's also just a funny experience because you realize, like, I'm not here to be funny. The show is funny, but we can also talk about serious, really meaningful things. And it was wonderful. My dad got to come, which is super excited. He
Oh,
was
really?
he was
Oh,
in
that's
town,
fun.
so he was in the audience, which is really cool.
Well, that's a good segue into this next one. So, one of the things that you recounted both in the book and on the show is the story of after you gave this speech. And if people don't know about it, just Google Mallory McMorrow and, Senate speech. And this is what created well, you created the movement, but it was that impetus that blew you up in a good way. But you talk about the fact that you missed a call from Joe Biden. He had to clarify that it was President Joe Biden, just in case you didn't know who that was or the recognizable voice. And then the thing that I really loved is, and you go into this in the book, telling the story about the advice your mom gave to you after the speech. This is before she decided that she wasn't going to go after State Senator Tice and beat her up. I think it's a really important one, though, and it really stuck with me. So I won't steal your thunder, but tell us what she shared with you.
Yeah, so, I gave the speech and I genuinely thought it was going to be the last speech I gave on the Senate floor. I was in such a dark place. I didn't think I was going to run for reelection, but I put the video of the speech online, and within 24 hours, it was viewed tens of millions of times and it was all over, national, international news. So I had to call my mom and tell her that I gave a speech about her at work, and
Fortunately, you said nice things about
I
her, which
said
you had to
nice things
clarify.
about her. Well, and she appreciated that, but then she asked why. And then I told her why I had to give this speech, that, a colleague accused me of basically wanting to molest children because that's the political climate that we live in. And my mom, after her initial gut instinct, which was to come out here and seek revenge on her firstborn, which thank God she did not do, she gave it a few days and she watched the response and the media coverage and just how meaningful this was to so many people. And she and I were talking about it a few days later, and she said, Mal, this is great, but it's not going to mean anything if, 12 million people watch your speech and they don't do what you did. And I thought about just how we engage in advocacy and politics. And it does feel like we are, in many ways, even before I was in this role, we're passive viewers. Like, we're watching our team versus the other team. And we love when somebody has a clap back moment and, when they're hitting each other and you can kind of like cheer them from the sidelines. But if we're not actively participating and using our agency and building real relationships with, and it doesn't have to be the president or your federal officials, but your local city council members, and you know who your state legislators are. And if you're not willing to, if you're in a group of people and your friend says something really crass and inappropriate about somebody in a way that hurts them, if you're not willing to like throw an elbow and say, hey man, knock it off, we are not actually doing anything to improve our communities. And in a lot of ways, that's where this book came from, was my recognition and my mom's question, I can't do this alone. Nobody can do this work alone. I've seen both from the outside and the inside now as a legislator, I've seen successful advocacy. I've seen unsuccessful advocacy. I've seen people waste their time. I've seen people be really effective at how to do this. So it really, became a guide for anybody and everybody to learn how to find your motivation, how to tell a compelling story, how to engage with elected officials, and how to make a real difference. Because the only way we get out of this ugly, horrific moment in our country is if more of us recognize we actually have power and we stop letting the entertainment of politics dominate our energy and our time, and we actually stand up and participate.
Well, so I'm going to skip to this next question since we've now mentioned the book a dozen times and haven't really said the title. And so earlier this year, I believe you released this book called Hate Won't Win. Find your power and leave this place better than you found it. I love that little addition. It's a nice way to
It's
subtly
a
sort of
long
talk
title, but I
about.
really pushed to have the whole title in there.
But you know what? It actually, so hate won't win. That's great. You sort of get what it means, but it's fighting for change on top of that. And one of the things, you were incredibly prescriptive about your process, learning how to run for Senate, and then how other people can do it, which was fascinating. And I never thought I would say those words about learning the political process. But one of the things that I love is on Amazon, the book is billed as a blueprint for creating the communities and country we want. Can we talk about a few of the blueprint items and maybe the new American dream, success, safety, and sanity thread through there?
Sure. So, what I talk about in the book, and the book is pretty unorthodox, I would say, for political memoirs. Half of the book is a bit of a memoir, so that the reader knows who I am and how I got here and how I got into this position where all of a sudden I was on all the all the national news, with the speech that I gave and what we did with it. But really, I wanted the memoir to show that I'm not special in any way, that I was just a regular person who Googled how to run for office and figured it out. You can figure out how to do this and how to make change like you can learn just about anything else. The second half of the book is what I'm really excited about. It is a step-by-step guide, chapter by chapter, for Secretary for the Human Rights Campaign. Really to understand you don't have to try to make an impact on every single issue, which can feel uncomfortable. It can feel like there are so many horrible things happening. I want to try to do something. But think of it, if you tried to learn how to play the piano and become a chef and run a marathon and write a novel, you would be horrible at
It's a
all of
lot.
those things. It's a
Yeah,
lot.
that's a lot.
You can't do it all. But if you pick one thing and you go deep on that one thing, you can really make an impact over time on that issue. And then from there, I talk about how to do that. So you found your motivation, you found your one thing. Then I talk about how I've learned how to tell a compelling story, which starts with understanding your audience. And your audience is not people who already agree with you, it's people who don't, which means you got to shed some of your expectations. Maybe you talk a different language. And I have some side by side examples of even speeches that I've used on gun violence prevention, for example, where I have one speech I gave that has a lot of facts and figures and research, which is fine. But then I have another version where I tell two constituent stories and you feel it. You feel the loss that they felt in a way that you can see how the door might be open to passing policy change. And I talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's a hero of mine, and how when she started in her, she was at the ACLU and she was given all of these cases about discrimination against women, and she refused to take them up. Instead, she took up a case of discrimination against a young man in Oklahoma who couldn't buy beer because he was 19. In Oklahoma, you could buy beer when you were 18 if you were a woman. You couldn't buy beer until you were 21 if you were a man. And she took up that case understanding that her audience was the all-male, much older Supreme Court justices. so that if they could see themselves in this young man and understand that, yes, you can be discriminated against based on your sex, then it opens the door for all of these other cases where now we have gender protections for women because she understood her audience. And again, it's not malicious. Those justices simply would not understand women being discriminated against if they had never felt it. So, and then it goes through how to engage with elected officials. I say that you should never fill out online petitions like change.org surveys.
I'm glad you
And
brought that up because I was going to throw that in, and
what you should do
I actually
instead,
think that was welcome news.
the thing I hate more than anything is watching people waste their time. Like, your time is precious. I want to help you learn how to maximize your time and energy to actually make the change that you want to see. And it's not going to happen overnight. Like, this is a lifetime of work. It is going to require that you consistently put in time and effort and energy. You don't have to quit your job and run for office. Like, you don't have to do what I did, but you can and should get engaged. And then the back of the book has a workbook section. So I encourage people to get a journal and just start and test things on your own. I have, 50 different examples of how to engage in government and institutions in your community, all different levels, and you can just try stuff out and see what works for you. And it's been great so far. I mean, people tell me they love it. I love when people like tweet at me and they tell me they found where their local Democratic club was and they didn't know they had one, and then they went and they met people they really like. So it's been really rewarding so far.
I think I'm not surprised. And I will tell you, I've been thinking about writing a book. I wrote a dummies book way back when, but your format and the story, like particularly listening to you narrate it, was also a bonus. But I just loved sort of the approachability, but the prescriptive nature of what you did. There are two things. One, I just want to make a comment, and then I'd like to ask you a question. So, in chapter 6 of the book, you had an epiphany that was simple yet profound, and I think this inspired the speech. Right, it was one of the things that did. And you said, "What if this kept happening? I mean, all of the sort of hate and all of
Mhm.
the bullshit that we talked about earlier, not because we refused to give bullies attention, but because we had refused to stop them." And I
Mhm.
think your chess analogy is one of those such things. So that was amazing. And I have a daughter that's gay. So the fact that you've spoken out against, all of the hate against LGBTQ and other minorities. This is the question that is in the book, similar to the don't do these online petitions. You do talk about the fact, and this seems counterintuitive as a politician, that people should stop watching cable news like not just Fox, but
Mhm.
CNN and MSNBC. I know you also received some pushback from some fairly powerful Democrats who didn't like this prescriptive advice, but maybe just give us a quick answer in terms of why should people stop watching this?
Yeah, I mean, look, we as humans were never designed to take in so much information at once. The news, when Walter Cronkite gave the news, then it would just cease broadcasting afterwards. It was like, that was the end of the day. There is no more news. Go to bed, come back tomorrow, and we'll give you the news. And that was legitimate news. 24-hour cable news is designed to keep you engaged for as many hours as possible so that they can sell ad space. It's the business model. And one of the challenges I say in the book is turn on any cable news network and just let it play for an hour or 2 hours. And then ask yourself, did you actually learn the contents of any legislation? Did you learn how to better understand government? Or did you hear things like, here's what the Republicans did and why you should be mad at them? Here's what Marjorie Taylor Greene did, and she's in a fight with this person. Because conflict is what sells, and what they call breaking news all the time is really just conflict. The current conflict that I think about with my party is, what is David Hogg doing, right? Like a vice chair of the DNC is not the most effective person to be thinking about when you're advocating for change in your community. So that's not to say that cable news is bad. I mean, I am frequently on cable news as a guest, but it's everything in moderation. So I know we all know somebody in our lives who I think thinks that because it's news, I'm using air quotes, that if I just leave it on in the background all day, maybe I work from home, that I'm going to be informed about what's going on. And that's how I can stay connected. That's not how you stay connected. I have an entire chapter in the book about how to build a healthy news diet. I am somebody who loves newspapers because they come to my house and I can sit down with a coffee and my daughter asks questions about the stories that are in it and I read some of them to her. I was reading to her about AI
This is Noah.
models last week. Yeah, Noah, she's 4. I don't think she understands AI, but she pointed to a story and she was like, read that to me. And it just gives you time to sit and process and think. And the same thing goes for social media. So like, I'm not going to be naive enough to say people should not get their news from social media, because more and more that is where people are getting their news. But turn the notifications off. Like, it is quite literally designed to give the same dopamine response as slot machines. That's why it's a pull scroll and why the notifications are red and why there's a buzz. And like it is designed to be addictive. And forming a healthy relationship where I used to be so dedicated as to just give myself an hour in the morning before I started my day that was news. And that is when I read all the news headlines and then I turned it all off. So I have ADHD. Maybe you don't have to be as rigid as I am about like setting hard boundaries, but just know that, understand the purpose behind different companies because these are companies that have a business model that is they make money by holding on to your attention as long as possible, and that may not be healthy.
Well, and it's smart. And I do like the fact that you were bipartisan about it. And you said it's all news stations. And again, it's having a healthy relationship with it. And I think that is smart to make sure that I read Katie Couric's newsletter every morning. And I get literally, it's like in 3 minutes, I've got all the global news, I've got all the national news. And if I want to dive into the stories, I can.
There you go.
I have an
Heather Cox
important question.
Richardson, another great one for if
Oh,
you
yeah,
want
Heather Cox
one daily
Richardson is
newsletter.
brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah, so smart, so smart. You can find her, I think, on Facebook and other places. I do want to do something that's in service to you. And I am prepared to jump in addition to this podcast, but how can people best support you as a candidate for the US Senate in your upcoming election, which will be in 2026?
Thank you. Yeah, it feels like a long way away. I am running for U.S. Senate in Michigan in 2026. They can find out more at mcmorrowformichigan.com. Michigan being a battleground state, no matter where you're listening, we're going to need your support. All eyes are always on Michigan. It's going to be one of the most expensive races in the country. So if you could donate, great. If you want to sign up to volunteer, you can do it from anywhere. And if you're in Michigan, depending on when this airs, we will be kicking off a brewery tour very soon. So I hope people will come grab a beer with me and tell me what keeps you up at night and how we can build a better state and a better country together.
Well, and you have a good model in Senator Alyssa Slotkin, who's one of my favorites, and I've met a few times. And I donate to her campaign. I'm now donating to your
Thank you.
campaign. So I will be at your service, and I'd love to come to the brewery and knock on doors or do whatever you need me to do. So I do want to shift to a little bit of my fun questions. This is us getting to know you a little bit better, those who
All
may
right.
not have had a chance to listen to or read the book. My first one is, what's the dirtiest sounding word that isn't actually dirty? I use as an example, spatchcock.
Oh, I go with poppycock. It's one that
Poppycock.
just hear it. It's the hard sounds that I think just makes it sound dirtier than it
I
is.
like that. That's
Although,
a good one. And I love,
yeah, my little
no, go
sister,
ahead.
having grown up on SpongeBob, I also think barnacles is a good one, just because they use it as a
Barnacles
curse
is
word.
that's a very good one, actually. I appreciate that you took some time to think about that. Okay. You've had a chance to meet some very famous people, including presidents. You've had Hillary Rodham Clinton retweet you. You were a surrogate for Kamala Harris. Who, out of all the famous people you've met, has impressed you the most?
I really admire people who don't let fame have gone to their head. I met Sam Richardson, who is an actor. People may remember him from Veep and House Party and Detroiters. He is a Michigan native. And I reached out. I don't know how we got connected, but he did a virtual fundraiser with Tim Robinson. So Sam and Tim are best friends in real life.
One of my favorites. Yep.
And we did a Detroiters reunion virtual Zoom fundraiser for my PAC a couple of years ago when I was supporting other state legislative candidates. But just like, I hope I'm not sharing too much, but he was out of the country shooting a movie. And I had reached out to say, oh, I'm running for US Senate to you about it. And he like found time from halfway across the world to just call and say how excited he was and whatever he needs. And he's in it, just, he doesn't have to do that. He could have sent me to an assistant or an agent or whoever, but like just somebody who never forgets where he came from, loves Michigan so much. And that is always really impressive to me that, you're still a person, even if you've got a bunch of Emmys.
Yeah, no, and those are the people that I think that do take the time, right, and carve out the time to see you. Let's name one band that you wished you had seen in concert but have not had a chance to.
This is going to peg me as a very certain demographic, but Guster. I never got to see Guster.
Custer.
I really wanted to.
I'm sure they'll be touring again one of these days. You know, these bands that sort
I'm
of,
sure. Yeah, now that I had to catch myself a couple of years ago. I was like, wow. It was when Dr. Dre and Eminem were in the Super Bowl halftime show. And I was like, wow, they're finally making a good Super Bowl halftime show. And then I recognized, no, I'm just getting older. Like,
I think both can be true. Well, here's what we can do is I will help you when you win as U.S. Senator. We will have Guster come and play at your party. How's that sound?
yes, let's do it.
All right, good. That's a deal. All right. I'm really curious about this one because you are so honest in your book talking about literally everything. What's one of the most embarrassing moments in your life?
I mean, there's so many. So I grew up looking like Little Orphan Annie. So I had short, tight, curly hair that, was a Little Orphan Annie afro. And my mom used to Velcro bows into it, and I never grew it out. So I finally grew my hair out for the first time, and I was like 8 or 9. I mean, it was pretty late, and I didn't realize you had to brush it because I had never. So the whole underside of my head knotted up into one massive rat's nest. And we were in a salon and we probably went through like 3 bottles of detangler and then trying to yank it all out. And it just wasn't working. So I had an undercut that just shaved half of my head. So there was a whole summer where, and it wasn't like a cool, like punk undercut because it was just a curly mess up top. So it was an entire awkward summer just because I didn't know you had to brush your hair.
Well, I love that you're willing to do that. I've had a few guests on already, and it's the one question that stumps people. So thank you for having one and being
Of
willing to
course.
share that.
I'm
Just two
glad
more quick
I did
questions.
that before social media because that
Yeah,
doesn't
and before
exist
you
in
ran for
public.
U.S. Senator, right?
I'm sure there's photos somewhere, but they will not see the light of day.
Two more questions, then we'll wrap it up. So, we talked about famous people that you've met. Who is one person you'd like to meet? They could be living or dead.
There were two. I couldn't pick one, but they're in the same vein. Robin Williams and Lucille Ball. So I love anybody who can connect over humor. And Robin Williams grew up here in Michigan for at least part of his life in Bloomfield Hills, and Birmingham. And just, there's very few people, I think, in his celebrities who, when they pass, like, I really feel deeply sad about it. That was one that it was just crushed me. Everything that he was in deeply moved me. All of the anecdotes about him hiring homeless people on set when he was shooting movies, giving people opportunities, just such a lovely use of talent and somebody who was open about mental health struggles that I think is really important. And then, as a redhead, Lucille Ball breaking all kinds of expectations and being hilarious and being in a mixed marriage. My husband is Jewish, so that's something that I think about all the time. And just banging down every door and putting her name on her productions before women were really empowered to do anything in the entertainment industry is something that I love. Would love to
Well, they're
get
great
both of
because
them
they really.
together if they could.
Oh, we have to do a mashup of that. Someone has to figure out with AI getting the two of them together because they both broke through in very different ways. I mean, you might be a little on the young side of this, but Mork and Mindy, right? So that
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah.
his acting debut, and that was after he'd been a stand-up comedian. By the way, a little side note, which since you've introduced both concepts, I love on your Twitter page that you talk about that you're running for Senate and all these other things, and then you say that you're Ray Wert's ginger half. So I love that as a nod to the ginger and to your husband Ray.
We balance each other out.
Exactly. Well, last question, and I think as you probably know, and if you don't, this show is about people who are influential across the spectrum, but that are doing societal good. And clearly, you are doing a tremendous amount of societal good through your job. Who's somebody else that you would recommend I have on the show?
Kyra Harris Bolden. So she is the first Black woman state Supreme Court justice here in Michigan. She's also a friend of mine. She and I were classmates in Emerge, which is a national organization that recruits and trains Democratic women to run for office. And she ran for Supreme Court justice while she was pregnant. So just incredible, a lovely human being. She has just a really moving story about her great grandfather who was lynched in the path, between that and her becoming a Supreme Court justice. And she always says justice for generations is something that is why she does this work. So I love her and she would be a great guest.
I'll tell her Senator Mallory McMorrow sent me. And with that, Mallory, I want to thank you for being on the show. I am a huge fan. I hope others listening in will be equal in their fandom because you're doing just amazing things and we wish you nothing but the best. And I'll look back when you are finally the president of the United States in, 8 or 10 years. I'll say, oh, I got to interview the president back in the day.
My goodness. Well, Aaron, thank you.
You're welcome.